Hi everyone, welcome. These two bins down here on the lower shelf marked ANC1 and ANC2 are the systems we're going to be checking in on today. It's only been 10 days since the last check-in, and well, for that matter, it was a 10-day interval between check-ins last time we fed them too. They're only 32 days of age, and the systems that they used to live in have not been fully retired yet. The labels have been flipped upside down to show that the primary haul out of worms has already occurred, but we've not yet harvested the castings because it was suspected that after the main haul out occurred to populate the two new 32-day-old systems that there were probably still straggler worms left in this material. So what you see out here are the bait boxes that I configured, and whoop, let's just settle this one back down here. This one, for whatever reason, when I took off the plastic and rested it on the table so that I can put the bait box onto the plastic, a lot of the worms just started going down through the holes in the bottom of the container down onto the plastic. I didn't want those worms thinking that they should try to exit the bait box again, so I figured if I set it up that way, then maybe they'll just stay put in the bait box until we can get on with the reunion, because it's time to call these two systems as complete. I went through the material in this system, and after 10 days of baiting, all the worms that were stragglers remaining in the stuff ended up in the bait box, with the exception of 2 that I fished out of the material here. There were quite a few more still. There were 30 that I pulled out individually. For the longest time I was at 29. I was like, oh, let's make it a nice round number, and after another almost 10 minutes of extra searching, I found one last worm to make it 30 worms that I pulled out of the material here that had not made their way into the bait boxes yet. I believe because the material in here was a little bit more damp, a little bit more cozy and forgiving for the worms to want to remain in. Here it had gotten dry enough that the worms were looking for something better, and the majority of them made their way into the bait boxes. So we're going to get these bait boxes, or at least the occupants of these bait boxes, reunited with the primary population. And for the primary population, I've got a nice treat, a yummy cucumber feast. So I'm going to get the systems up on the bench, get the reunion underway, and get the feeding completed. Let's get to work. Oftentimes when the worms get cucumber around here, it's just the cucumber peels, or sometimes just the end cut off. But in this case, they're actually getting the entire cucumbers. After they got peeled, there was something about them that just didn't seem like they were good enough to be used for cucumber salad, and they went into the freezer. Compliments of my mom. Worms should appreciate this. Nice big fat juicy cucumber in both cases. This one's kind of thick, this one's kind of long and thin, kind of making me wonder where this piece should go. So let's get to feeding these little guys. As I recall, the last feeding consisted of the same sort of stuff that I had used to put into the bait boxes 10 days ago. We gave watermelon and cantaloupe melon rinds. And man, look at these top covering newspapers. The worms have been busy working this stuff down. That was my idea, actually, was to repurpose these top cover newspapers to accompany the feeding and make this, plus a few napkins that I've got off on the side, the foundational bedding to place underneath the food. So I think that works out well. I wasn't even sure what kind of state these top covering newspapers were in, but it does look like at least the one that was in bin number 1 had already gotten so worn down by worm action that it probably is just best off getting reused in another way other than continuing with top covering function. And since I don't have coffee or coffee filters for these worms today, we'll just hang on to those coffee filters that I removed a moment ago. Those were just showing where we last fed. You know, I'm noticing some flying insects here. Well, they're not flying, they're walking around. The one that's here, the little tiny one, and this little tiny one, these are just individual insects. The one you see, the larger one, that's actually 2 of them connected to one another back to back. So I'm glad that I replenished my supply of pulverized Mosquito Dunks, because I'd like to get a good, generous treatment of that stuff in here. And even though we might have some flying insects that have made themselves at home in here, if they attempt to reproduce, as we already saw they're trying to do, they can do that, but their offspring is never going to get to the point where it can mature to becoming a mature flying insect. The way I understand the mosquito dunks to work is that it interferes with the ability of the larva to develop beyond the larval stage into a mature flying insect. So even though mating and all that other sort of stuff is going to be occurring in here, it won't become a haven for further fly propagation, hopefully. So I can already see some of the rinds of these cantaloupe melons. I can always tell when there's still a little bit of the melon attached to the rind, because the rind doesn't flop like a little piece of paper. It still has a little bit of rigidity because there's still just a little bit of actual melon attached to the rind. But, you know, despite the fact that there's still a little bit of leftover food from the last meal, I'm not inclined to back away from my plan to feed. That's just not the way I roll. We're going to be proceeding with the feeding of those lovely cucumbers into these systems. And since the top covering newspapers are being repurposed to become foundational bedding under the feeding, we'll be sprinkling some nice leaves across the top of these systems as a replacement top covering. So we found a few leftover pieces of cantaloupe melon rind. That's just fine. We'll probably encounter the similar setup over here in bin number 2. And it just feels like I should already begin with the reminding of myself not to overlook the non-routine thing that I'd like to do at the very end, which is once we're done feeding and all that other fun stuff, is to go grab those bait boxes and to conduct the quick little reunion and release of the rounded up worms in the bait boxes. And then that'll make it official. At that point I can consider the material in those 2 boxes as harvestable. And then that'll be the opportunity to free up those boxes for other worm farming purposes. I do have the estimates of all the different people that have contributed their numbers. The people who viewed the initial launch of these systems when the worms got hauled out of their old home and situated in here in these new bins 32 days ago. But here and there I still get a comment from somebody who's arriving a little bit late to the party to watch that video and to contribute their estimate for how many worms they believe were placed into these systems. So I don't have the exact numbers. Once those contributions of the viewers begin to settle down, I'll announce the estimated worm count for each system at some point, and that'll probably happen pretty soon. But I figured today let's focus on getting the extra worms out of the bait boxes into the systems here, and then focusing our thoughts about numbers on estimating how many additional worms are being added to each system. So that's going to be something I'm going to be asking everyone to do at the end. Once we empty the bait boxes into these systems, I'll do my best to try to show the worms that are being released, and then I'll ask that everyone, you guys, the viewers, provide me with your estimates. How many worms do you believe were added to each system? And then I'll be including those numbers in the averaging calculations to up the numbers in each system to account for the newly added worms coming out of the bait boxes. So these are the nice big generous napkins, the big huge luxurious napkins that I get from my mom. So between the napkins and the food itself, a large portion of the stuff that is going into here is from my mom's. Not to mention the fact that I get a lot of eggshells from my mom, with which I make the grit that I'm adding right now. And then when you look at all the bedding that I have, a lot of the material that I make my bedding out of comes from my mom's too. She provides the the paper towel tubes and the toilet paper tubes, the cardboard with which I make some of my bedding, and I was thinking about the newspapers. I was thinking about putting them down as foundational, but I'm wondering if we might benefit from doing it kind of in a layered fashion. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put the big juicy cucumber down at the bottom. Look at the size of that. It already has that foundation of napkin under it. And then perhaps, I don't know, perhaps we'll put this extra piece over here. Makes them both look alike to a certain point. So we'll save all this peel to put on top after we've put in the remainder of this bedding type material. And this way we'll give all this bedding type material a really good shot at getting consumed along with the foods. And then in a way we're also putting a little bit of insulation over here on top of this large frozen mass of stuff, so that when we backfill the hole and we return a bunch of material that could have some worms in it, we're not going to be feeling like we just plopped a bunch of worms right on top of some frozen stuff. So let's grab some peel to drop into bin number 1, and the rest of the peel to drop into bin number 2. And that, I believe, is going to be a really appreciated feeding, or at least I hope it is. And you know, just for comparison, you can see these are the El Cheapo napkins that I have here at my house. They don't even compare, not in the least. But I had a couple of these laying around that I figured I'd place in here as well. And now I think we can start getting things leveled off. But once again, I'm going to remind myself, don't forget, we're going to do a reunion here at the end. So once I attempt to get things covered up and leveled off, as far as the feeding goes, in are going to go the contents of those bait boxes. And those bait boxes also still have some bedding material in them. Over the past 10 days, I'm sure the worms have been busy nibbling on that stuff too, along with the melon that was put into each bait box to lure them in there. So we'll also be supplementing bedding slightly just by emptying the bait boxes into here. And that right there looks pretty good. I think as far as the feeding zone indicator goes, we'll hold off on putting that down after we've done the emptying of the bait boxes and the release of the worms. So let's set up a nice level surface onto which we can empty the bait boxes, and then that'll pretty much bring an official end to the environment that these wormies used to occupy in the past. So things look really good. Oftentimes I expect to see the majority of the worms that occupy these systems down near where the feeding zone was, but I mean, right now I could see I just unearthed a whole bunch of worms that were just hanging out on the edge. Sometimes the edge of the systems is even more popular for worms to hang out in for whatever reason. I don't know why, but it just seems to be. All right, let's not spend any more time on gawking at the worms. A lot of times I'll just stare at the mound of worms that I've lifted up out of the system and hold it there in front of the camera for a while, but I'd really like to get those bait boxes over here and get those worms released. So remember, I'm looking for everyone's input, so please watch carefully as we come over here with, let's see, how was this? These were the worms that came out of bin number 1, so they can go into bin number 1, the new bin number 1. And these were the worms that were bait out of old bin number 2, and they can go into new bin number 2. I'll just grab these few little extra pieces of bedding that stuck to the top coverings. So before we release the worms, let's just take a peek inside of each of these bait boxes to see what we ended up with. Seems like we got a pretty good turnout. At least a few dozen worms. I can see some of the leftover cantaloupe melon rind that was placed in here to bait them out, and they've stripped the stuff pretty clean of any of the melon that might have remained on there. Perhaps even better than what happened in the main systems. Interesting to see. And then over here, in the bait box that was deployed into bin number 2, once again, a nice turnout. Yeah, look at that. Wow, okay. We got ourselves a pretty good turnout. I'm not too surprised that the one in bin number 2, the bait box in bin number 2, has a pretty good size number of worms in it, perhaps even more than what we rounded up out of bin number 2. I mean bin number 1, because the old bin number 2 just seemed like it was much more damp. A lot more damp, meaning when we did the migration, perhaps just a lot more worms remained in this stuff as stragglers, because they hadn't been motivated to move out, because it just wasn't so dry yet and uncomfortable that they were looking for a better place to be. So let's make this happen. Let's just empty each container. See, this little guy's trying to go out the bottom. All I'm interested in is making sure all the worms are out. I can always clean out the residual bedding that's sticking to each container later. So let's just spread these little guys out, see if we can get a better view of how many worms are being reunited with the rest of the crowd over here in bin number 1. And same story here. A couple worms kind of adhering to the bottom of the container. Let's make sure they're with the rest of the gang, and I can proceed with cleaning up the bait boxes and putting them away. So yeah, many more worms being added to bin number 2. And you know, the worm count in these systems was very close. Just a couple dozen off, but I feel like we're probably going to up the number in bin number 2 by releasing the stragglers. So that's it for these little guys. Let's give them a moment to settle in, and then we can get things covered up and we'll be done. So, do you have some numbers in mind? I know I do. I know what I'm going to be entering into my spreadsheet, and I'd love to enter your estimates into my spreadsheet too. And then we'll be updating the estimated worm counts in these systems to reflect those added worms. And then at some point in the near future, I'll definitely make an official announcement in terms of how many worms are thought to occupy each of these systems. I just didn't come down prepared with that info today, but perhaps next time we could. And you know, the old environment that these little guys lived in for 320 days, and now 32 days later, now that we've pulled out the stragglers and reunited them with the rest of the wormies, that brings us within less than 2 weeks of almost an entire year since their old environment was originally launched. And that's pretty cool, you know. I mean, it's hard to believe that what you saw in those other bins over there was really the product of worms working for pretty much an entire year or close to it. But for me, going that long, going up to 300 or more days in a worm bin was unheard of in the past when I started. For me, 150 days, half that was even, you know, to me it seemed like a very long time. So I guess when you're new and you've only got so many worms and so many worm bins, you're anxious to get your first harvest of vermicompost, you're anxious to get the systems to the finish line, but I guess I've gotten over that. And I'm comfortable letting the systems run for quite a bit longer anymore these days. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Please don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know how many worms you believe we released into each system. And then at some point soon, we'll be sharing the numbers with you guys in terms of what all the average numbers are of everyone's estimates to come up with the official worm counts for each system. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.